Okay, so we're diving into some fascinating stuff today. The 2022 EWEC Statistical Report. I know you've had a chance to really dig through this one. What's the big takeaway for you here?
Well, this report from EWA, the Emirates Water and Electricity Company, it really lays out the whole landscape of, electricity and water in the UAE, like how it's all made, used, and planned for at this point. Pretty impressive, really.
So it's like a window into Abu Dhabi's and the wider UAE's power situation. That's pretty cool. I mean, I think a lot of people are interested in that stuff, but maybe not quite ready to wade through a whole dense report, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's why I'm glad we're doing this deep dive. I mean, we can pull out the really interesting bits without overwhelming everyone with, tons of data.
Right on. So let's start with the basics then. What exactly does EWEC do? I mean, it's more than just keeping the lights on, isn't it?
Oh, way more. They're actually the system operator and the sole procurement entity for all the electricity and water produced in Abu Dhabi and even beyond.
Sole procurement entity. So they're like the gatekeepers for the whole energy supply.
Yeah, you could say that. They're the ones making sure that everything runs smoothly. The water's flowing and the lights stay on.
That's a huge responsibility. I mean, talk about essential services.
Totally. They handle something called system dispatch, which basically means they decide which power plants and desalination facilities are running and at what levels at any given time.
So they're constantly adjusting the output to match demand.
Yeah, and they've also got to do demand forecasting, which is predicting how much electricity and water will be needed, in the future.
Makes sense. I mean, you can't just wait till the lights go out to start thinking about how much power you need, right?
Exactly. And then they've got this thing called generation expansion planning, which means figuring out what new infrastructure they'll need to meet those future demands.
So they're thinking long term, planning for growth and making sure the system can keep up. That's really forward thinking.
Oh, yeah. And they're not just focused on keeping up. They're also leading the charge towards a more sustainable energy future.
Right. I mean, the UAE has some pretty ambitious goals when it comes to clean energy and sustainability.
Totally. And EWEC is right at the forefront of making that happen. They're developing a low-carbon system for both power and water production.
So they're really putting those goals into action, not just talking about them.
Absolutely. They're working towards the UAE Energy Strategy 2050 and that big net zero by 2050 strategic initiative.
Impressive. So how do we know they're actually walking the walk, so to speak? I mean, are there any signs of their commitment to quality and all that?
Yeah, actually. They've got all these certifications like ISO 9001 for quality management, ISO 14001 for environmental sustainability, and OHSS 18001 for occupational health and safety.
So it's not just lip service. They've actually gone through the process of getting certified.
Right. It shows a real commitment to operating at the highest standards, across the board.
All right. Well, that gives us a solid foundation. Now let's dive into the actual electricity data from the report. Where should we start?
Well, a good place to begin is with the overall trends in electricity demand. The report has this really interesting chart that shows the total peak and minimum electricity demands in Abu Dhabi, going all the way back to 1999.
1999. Wow. That's a long-term view.
Yeah, and what's really striking is that both the peak and minimum demands have been steadily increasing over that entire period.
Okay, so demand is going up. That makes sense, I guess, with all the growth and development in the region. But just how fast is it growing?
Well, the report highlights an average annual demand growth of 8.0% overall.
8% every year. That's pretty significant.
It is. And even if we focus on a more recent period, from 2005 to 2022, the average annual growth is still a solid 7.4%.
Wow. So the need for electricity just keeps climbing. I mean, that's a lot of pressure on the system.
It is for sure. And that's why all that planning and forecasting we talked about is so crucial. They've got to stay ahead of the curve.
Totally. Now, the report also digs into the ratio of minimum to peak demand. What can we learn from that?
That's where things get even more interesting. You see, the ratio of system electricity minimum peak demands chart shows us the percentage that the lowest electricity demand reaches compared to the highest demand in a given year.
Okay. So it's showing us how much the demand fluctuates throughout the year.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that this ratio isn't constant. It's been changing over time.
So what's that telling us?
Well, back in 1999, the minimum demand was only about 30% of the peak demand.
Okay. So a pretty big swing between high and low usage.
Yeah. But in more recent years, like in 2022, that figure has risen to around 46%.
So the gap between the highest and lowest demand times is narrowing. What's driving that?
That's a great question. It could suggest that there's a more consistent baseline level of electricity usage now, maybe due to more industrial activity or even changes in how people are using electricity at home throughout the day and night.
Huh. That's a fascinating insight. I mean, who would have thought that the difference between peak and minimum demand would tell us something about how our lifestyles are changing?
It's all connected.
Yeah.
The data can reveal some pretty surprising things.
Agreed. Now, the report also has these cool visuals like the system load duration curves and electricity demand profiles for 2022. What can we learn from those?
Those give us an even more detailed view of how electricity demand is changing over time. The load duration curves show us how often the demand hits a certain level throughout the year.
So like a ranking of the hours of the year by their electricity demand.
Yeah, exactly. And the demand profiles show us the typical hourly demand patterns for specific days, like the day with the highest demand in July and the day with the lowest demand in January of 2022.
So we can see the daily ups and downs of electricity use.
Precisely. And what's really interesting is that the report pinpoints the maximum demand in 2022 as 12,503 megawatts. And that happened on July 25th.
So a scorching summer day. I'm not surprised.
Right. And the minimum demand was 5,655 megawatts on January 9th.
Makes sense. A cooler winter day, much less need for air conditioning and things like that.
Exactly. And when you look at the demand profiles for those days, you can see how the demand surges during the hottest parts of the day in July. And then it drops off significantly in the early morning hours of that January day.
So it's like a visual representation of how our energy use is tied to the climate. Pretty cool.
It is. And the report goes even deeper, breaking down monthly peaks and lows across different regions within the UAE.
Okay, so we're not just looking at the country as a whole. We're getting more granular.
Exactly. The report has these tables showing the peak monthly demand and the minimum monthly demand for Abu Dhabi, Al Ain, Al Dhafra, and the whole system. It covers the years 2018 to 2022.
And what does that regional breakdown tell us?
Well, as you might expect, the summer months have the highest demand across all the regions.
Right, because of the heat.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is that the specific month and the actual level of that peak demand can vary a bit between the regions.
So even though it's hot everywhere, the demand patterns aren't exactly the same.
Right. There might be slight differences due to things like industrial activity or even local weather variations.
So there are microclimates within the macroclimate.
Interesting. Yeah, and then when it comes to the lowest demand months, it's generally during the cooler months like January or February.
Makes sense. But I imagine there might be some regional differences there too.
There are. You might see the low point in Al Dhafra happening in a different month compared to Abu Dhabi City, for example.
So even within a relatively small geographic area, there can be these subtle variations in energy use.
Exactly. It all adds up to a pretty complex picture.
Totally. And then the report goes a step further and actually pinpoints the dates when those annual peak and minimum demands occurred.
Right. Those peak annual demand dates and minimum annual demand dates tables, they give us the specific day and even the time when those records were set in each region for each year.
So we're talking real-time snapshots of those extremes in demand.
Yeah, and a very clear pattern emerges when you look at the data. The peak demands almost always happen during the summer afternoons or evenings.
Okay, so those scorching hot hours when everyone's cranking up the AC.
Exactly. And then the minimum demands, they typically occur in the early morning hours during the winter months when everything is pretty quiet.
Makes sense. It's like the city is taking a collective deep breath before the day starts.
Yeah, something like that. All right, so we've talked about demand. Now let's switch gears and look at actual electricity consumption patterns.
Okay, so how much electricity is being used overall?
The report has a table and chart showing the annual energy demand in gigawatt hours, and it covers the same period from 1999 to 2022. And just like with demand, the overall trend is upward.
So more electricity is being used each year. No surprise there, I guess.
Nope. And it's happening across all the regions. Abu Dhabi, Al Ain, Al Dhafra, you name it.
Okay, so it's a system-wide increase. But I imagine the consumption isn't evenly spread throughout the year, right? I mean, seasonality must play a role here.
Definitely. The monthly energy demand table from 2018 to 2022 shows that consumption really fluctuates throughout the year.
And I bet those fluctuations are linked to those temperature changes we were talking about earlier, right?
You got it. You see much higher consumption during the hot summer months when everyone is using their AC.
Yeah.
And then it drops off during the cooler winter periods.
Okay. So predictable, but still important to see it laid out like that.
Yeah.
And then the report also looks at the ratio of monthly peak demand to the annual peak demand, both regionally and for the whole system.
Right. And those tables really highlight how concentrated the peak demand is within a given year.
Oh, you break that down for me.
So a high ratio for a particular month means that the demand during that month is almost as high as the absolute peak demand for the entire year.
So it shows how much those peak periods are driving the overall demand.
Exactly. It basically underscores how much those summer months stress the system.
I'm getting a real appreciation for how complex it is to manage a power grid, especially in a climate like this.
It's definitely a balancing act, but EWC seems to be doing a pretty amazing job.
Well, this has been a fascinating look at the electricity situation in Abu Dhabi and the wider UAE, thanks to the 2022 EWEC Statistical Report.
My pleasure. It's a treasure trove of information.
So to wrap things up, here's a question for our listeners to ponder. Given these trends in electricity demand and the UAE's commitment to a carbon-free economy, what do you think the biggest challenges and the biggest opportunities will be for the energy sector in the UAE in the years to come? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll catch you next time.
See you then.
Bye.